and welcome to episode 2 of A Dash of Chaos. I'm very excited to be recording this episode. It's been a little bit of a while since I have. Been about a month. Not because I haven't been wanting to record, but mostly because I've just been busy with a couple of things in my life. Not going to go into detail about that, but I am very, very excited and ready to do this episode. And first of all, welcome back if you are tuning in again. And thank you to everyone who listened to the first episode, which was about Army of the Dead, which I was very nervous about that episode. Obviously, it was the first episode I was doing for this podcast, and I felt like it went really well, and I've been getting some pretty good feedback about it and good reception, so I'm super, super thankful to everyone who's listened to that and who subscribed to the YouTube channel or has followed the Twitter account. It does mean the world to me. I'm still kind of getting the hang of this. Hopefully, I'll kind of work out everything and it won't sound like I'm just talking about nothing for about 45 to an hour, which is what I've decided that these episodes are going to kind of range from. There might be some mini episodes that are a little bit shorter, like anywhere between 20 to 30 minutes, but I've kind of decided that it's basically going to be 45 minutes to an hour per episode. So enough of that, enough of the chit chat. I'm very, very, very ready to kind of start this one because this is going to be the first of many episodes that I talk about my favorite book series, and which is now a television series, His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. And when I say it's my favorite book series, I read these books when I was 11 years old. I think it was 6th grade, I guess. My elementary school teacher suggested the series to me. Because I was just kind of blasting through our reading list. I love reading. I love books so much. And she suggested these books to me, and I'd never heard about them before. They were in our school library, so I checked them out, and I read them, and I could not put them down. And they have been so special to me since then. And I think they've been probably the most formative series I've ever read. In my childhood. Like many 90s kids, I kind of grew up reading, Harry Potter and the Chronicles of Narnia, Lord of the Rings, all that stuff. But for me, His Dark Materials stood out so much and continues to stand out. And for this episode in particular, what I do want to speak about, or what I want to discuss, is essentially what I love about the series as a way of introducing it, and also what it means to adapt this series going from page to screen, because His Dark Materials has been adapted twice, once as a movie and once right now as a television series. So I'll get into that a little bit later. But yeah, just to introduce what I like about the series, I'm gonna try not to give too many spoilers, just because I know a lot of my followers on Twitter are watching the series but haven't read the books, or are now reading the books in anticipation for the third season, and I don't want to spoil too much of what happens. But I think one of the biggest things about this series that I enjoyed the most were the characters, and I know that's a very typical thing to say, but I just remember as a young girl, Lyra to me was so relatable, not in the sense of, first of all, it was like the lead character was a girl, but I think what was so important was that her as a character, she was allowed to be a kid, and I feel like that's something that kind of, a lot of series take for granted, that even if it's, they're starting at around 11 or 12 and they age throughout the series, the writers will write these characters in a way that kind of forces them to grow up, because of how important their role is in the series. And usually, it's like the world will end or anything like that. It's like those big, adventure stories. And what I loved about this series was Lyra was allowed to just continuously be a kid, and she was curious, and the adults weren't necessarily treating her like a child, but like they weren't fully treating her like an adult, and but she never felt, she never felt like, oh no, all the adults are treating me like a child, they, I'm important. Like, she was like, yeah, I am a kid, and she continues that throughout, and she actually expects a lot of the adults in the series to understand what she's saying, even though she's going about it at a very, innocent and kind of naive way, and she doesn't understand why some of the adults won't just like trust her, type thing. And I really love that. And it's the same thing when gets introduced in book 2, which is cool. In the new HBO BBC series, they actually introduced him in season 1, which I was not expecting. So as a book fan, that was really, really cool for me to get to actually be introduced to Will so early, even though I already knew his character. But it is the same thing. When Will gets introduced, there's a lot on his shoulders, and he gains a role as the knife bearer, but he's still very much allowed to be a kid. And again, I'll get into the series once I actually talk about it, but that's just something I respected so much. And obviously when I was a little bit older, I started to listen and read interviews with Philip Pullman, the author, and what I realized was he himself as a writer has such a respect for what children can do and what they understand. He firmly believes that, you shouldn't necessarily detract a child from reading certain things. Like, obviously there's going to be content that isn't necessarily age appropriate, but what he means by that is that you shouldn't really like believe that children can't understand these stories, or are too young to understand what's going on to some extent. So I think that really shows through his writing how much he respects, the ideas of children and the beliefs of children and what they contribute, and what they can teach adults, that a lot of adults will kind of like ignore, basically. And then one of my favorite characters, fictional characters, that has been like a huge favorite of mine for since I read it to now, which has been like 19 years later, basically, so almost 20 years. Mrs. Coulter, Marisa Coulter, such a cool character, and has been portrayed amazingly in both the movie and the TV series, even if the movie wasn't necessarily the greatest, but again, we'll get into that. And obviously there's a lot of things in his Dark Materials that I didn't quite understand as a kid, not because I couldn't figure out what was going on, but because there was some prior knowledge that you might need to know, and as I got older and I read certain things. So basically his Dark Materials is meant to be kind of a retelling of John Milton's Paradise Lost, and I have obviously not read Paradise Lost as an 11-year-old, but I did read it in high school. So after I kind of read that, I was like, oh, this makes a lot more sense in rereading his Dark Materials. And for someone who grew up in a Catholic household and went to Catholic church and everything like that, it's funny that I even though it was very obvious that the books were against the Catholic Church, I just never, it never occurred to me that these books were necessarily harmful or whatever to anyone who grew up Catholic. It just didn't occur to me until I was in high school, and they actually banned the books from high schools and all Catholic schools, actually. And I just remember, because the movie was coming out, and I just remember thinking but I love these books. And I might have been a little bit naive in not really understanding what was going on, but I think it's really cool. And I think, as much as people might want to say that this is anti-church or anti-Catholicism or whatever it is, in the end of it, the story is very much anti-institutions and anti-patriarchy, as it takes the biggest story of misogyny, which is in the Bible, that literally the fall of man is due to woman by Eve, and it subverts that. So I just think that's cool. And I'm not going to try and make this discussion about religion or faith or anything like that, but I just think that's really cool. And I think it's a cool way of subverting another story, another big story. But anyway, now into getting, into the fact that it has been adapted. what to me makes a good adaptation, I feel like this is a weird discussion to have, because I feel like if you love a book or like a comic book or whatever so much and it gets adapted onto the screen, you're going to feel a sense of, I don't know, I don't want to say gatekeeping, but that's probably like usually what happens, but it'll be important to you. And there's like a mix of being scared that they'll ruin the book, or and therefore ruin something you love, and the mix of being excited of seeing it like in live action or animation or whatever the visual medium is that they decide to adapt it to. And to me, I think there's three major things in terms of making an adaptation from page to screen, whether it's movies or TV or animation or whatever it is. I think one of the biggest thing is that it captures the spirit of the original source material. It feels like it is from that world, whether it has to do with the world building or the visuals or anything. Like, it does feel like, okay, I'm pulling these scenes from the book and I can physically see them. So, but it doesn't have to be exact, but I think like it's recognizable to you that it is from the original source material. So I think that's one, that would be number one for me. And number two, in just kind of connects with that, is to me it doesn't have to be exactly what's on the page. And it's funny because when I was younger, I used to say like, oh, I would love to see like an 8-hour movie of this book or whatnot. I would sit down and watch that. And as I got older, that actually changed, because I started to appreciate TV and film a lot more, and I watched a lot more TV and film. So I kind of recognized the limitations that you have for an on-screen adaptation. And it's not just, time constraints. That is a thing, a movie can only be X amount of time, or an episode can only be X amount of time. But it's really like the production that goes into it. So you have something like His Dark Materials, where they have the characters and their demons. Like, that is a lot of CGI that you're going to have to do to create those animals. And that's something that was very noticeable in the first season of the new series, that they couldn't put all the demons on screen, but it's like that's a budget constraint. So there's constraints to like what you can build, or what you can, you have the amount of money for. So you kind of have to recognize that too as a filmmaking thing. You can't just be like, well, why can't they put everything on screen? I'm like, well, like, you have to figure out the locations and everything like that. So that's like, just even on a technical term, it doesn't have to be exactly what's on the page, and there will have to be cuts, because books have a certain pacing that you can't achieve on screen, and that's not like to the creators that they're unable to do it. It's just a fact. And lastly, when you read a book, your imagination fills in the empty spaces of everything. Like an author describes a tree or a house or whatever it is, and your mind just creates that. Your imagination creates that. And when it's TV and film, it's actually up to the creators to fill in those blanks, like literally fill in those blanks, because then they have, like I was saying, they have to do locations and build sets and the CG. So it's like every inch of the screen has to be covered by something that is created versus what your imagination can actually do. And I feel like people just take that for granted as well. So that, to me, like, those are kind of the three major things that would make a really good adaptation. And I will say that visually, the 2008, I think it's 2008, yeah, 2008 film, the casting was awesome, and there was a lot of stuff that they did right. And it was definitely a clear attempt to create another successful series. So, like, again, I mentioned Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. Those were amazing book series. And they've been huge successes as films. And also the Narnia films had started as well. I believe the first one was in 2005, and that was a big success. So, like, I totally understand the want to adapt the series into a movie, and that was the medium at the time that was popular, and where books were adapted to, whereas nowadays I think it's almost like more common, and it's expected that book series will be adapted into a television series, just because it gives it the breathing room and less time constraints to tell the story. So yeah, there's been some really successful TV series that are based on books that I won't go listing that, but that's just kind of where that's moved towards. But in 2008, and again, I should really fact check, but in 2008, when they had the movie, again, they just wanted, I think studios were really jumping on that, and I believe it was the same studio that made Lord of the Rings, and they had just finished Lord of the Rings, and Harry Potter was starting to like continuously be popular, so I think they really wanted to do something else that was a bit more geared towards a younger audience, even though I think Lord of the Rings is like you can watch that when you're young. I did, but again, I understand that. So I get where that came from and the need, and but I think one of the biggest things that went wrong was that there was a lot of studio interference, which happens a lot. I'm a Zack Snyder fan, so I know all about studio interview. Well, I don't know about it, but I'm aware of it. And there was a huge forced studio removal of any topics to do with religion. And even though I personally didn't want to talk about like religion, it is a huge part of the series in terms of institutions, and to not be able to tell that in the story, huge portions were reworked or censored, and it just there's themes in there that don't quite land if you don't have that content. So that was probably a big part of the reason why it didn't do that well. And I think also there was this, I don't know if this is true, but I can only imagine that people might have thought it was a little too scary for children, which again is funny because Pullman doesn't believe in that, like doesn't believe that children can't, absorb this type of narrative. But it does have a lot of dark themes, and as the film adaptations of book series kind of moved on, I think it became less of a scare to adapt anything that was slightly less geared towards children, and if it would be profitable. But it definitely, to me, it feels like that was something that might have been changed in the script, because I feel like with the movie, a lot of the major things that happened are very much toned down, and one of the biggest things is they actually changed the ending so Roger doesn't die, and I think that's like a big thing that happens. And apparently the whole thing was that, they wanted to save it just in case they had more movies, but I don't think that's actually the case. I think they just didn't want to show a child dying on screen, especially in the way that it is, because it would have been Daniel Craig's character. So again, there's no, I haven't really fully looked into this. I did kind of a couple years ago, but that's what I really think it was. And speaking of Daniel Craig, that was such an amazing casting choice for Lord Asriel, and so was Nicole Kidman as Mrs. Coulter. And it's always wild to me that those two were cast as characters in a movie that wasn't very good, because I think visually they really captured exactly how I pictured them as a kid, and I think if it was a successful series, it would have done really well. However, now in the 2020s, I guess, like it started in 2019 with the BBC HBO series, I can't not see Asriel as Ruth Wilson, or sorry, as James McAvoy, and I can't see Liz Coulter as anyone but Ruth Wilson. I think they both have done such an incredible job with those roles, and I think the one that surprised me the most was James McAvoy, because I feel like every time, James McAvoy was in the Narnia series as Mr. Tumnus, so like I just kind of pictured him to be a little bit softer, so I was like, oh, maybe they're kind of going for like a softer Asriel, and he really surprised me at how he portrayed that character and that role, and I think he did really, really well. And not just them, just everything. I feel like the casting for that series has been really on the point, and getting someone like Daphne Keane, who she did so well in Logan, I was really excited to see what she was going to bring to Lyra, and she hasn't disappointed at all. And then Amir Wilson as Will has been fantastic as well. And like I mentioned at the beginning, it was so cool to have Will in season 1 because he doesn't appear in the book at all. He doesn't actually get introduced until book 2, which is the subtle knife. So, and I understood that change because it is very abrupt in the actual book series how he's introduced. Like Philip Pullman doesn't really introduce things like one normally would when writing a book. He kind of just drops the reader into certain things. And even with Northern Lights, with the first book and the first season of the television series, they created a whole intro scene which is actually pulled from another book of this new series that Pullman is currently writing within the same world. So they actually pulled that from the prequel book to kind of introduce what was going on, and that was really cool too. As a book fan, that's really cool because I know what they are pulling from, but I could also see that being a little bit confusing for anyone who hasn't read the books, but at the same time it does give it a better introduction to the characters than the book does, because if you've seen the TV show and you've seen season 1, the first episode, after that intro, then you get to see Lyra as like a 10 to 12 year old. I don't know how old she's supposed to be in the TV series. They're a little bit older, and you get to see her at Oxford and everything. But in the book, it actually literally starts with that scene where she's going into the room and sees that the master of Jordan College actually poisons Lord Asriel's wine. So it is very much like, I don't even know who this character is, and I don't know what's going on. I don't really know the world. There isn't world building right away, and it's just like, here's a demon. So there isn't really like a good introduction to that in the book. So you just kind of, as Lyra discovers things, you as the reader also discover things. So that's what I really love about Philip Pullman's writing, and I thought was really interesting when I was a kid, and as an adult I love that too. But I understand why that doesn't work for television, because not everyone's going to read the books. So they had to give it a bit more of a body introduction, just to allow people to be able to follow along a little bit easier. And that was something I didn't mind that change. Actually, honestly, all the changes that they've made to the series, I think, are well within the series, and you can tell that it is made by people who love the source material. And Philip Pullman himself is an executive producer, so he does kind of approve the changes and things like that. But he also gives the writers and the creatives a lot of free reign to explore, which I think is amazing, because not only do they expand the world building, they get to expand a lot of character interactions and have characters that never had scenes together in the books, have them actually together on screen, which was very cool for me, because I would be watching the show and I would still be surprised by certain things, and as someone who's read the books multiple times, I have like the anticipation of certain scenes, but to get to those scenes and then see that there's something added on, whether like the dialogue's changed a bit or they've added an extra character and it makes sense, very, very cool. There's this one scene in season 2 that's between Marisa Coulter and Lee Scoresby that is fully an added scene, and I think it's one of the best scenes of the series. And the fact that it wasn't even in the books is incredible. And I think Ruth Wilson and Lin-Manuel Miranda, like they were just like acting circles around each other in that sense. They just did it really, really well. And Ruth Wilson has really done an amazing job as Marisa Coulter. I did say before that, like, I thought Nicole Kidman was such an amazing casting job on the movie, and had the series continued on, you would have seen some incredible scenes from her. But like, I don't think I can unsee Ruth Wilson now, because she just got it. And also because they allowed more exploration of that character, I think I love that character more than I did when I read the books, and it's really cool. I don't necessarily think maybe because of Ruth Wilson, but just because it's the combination of how good of an actor she is, and the way that they've expanded her character. So yeah, that to me is like one of the most standout things of the series. Um, and also, I think I never realized how much seeing demons on screen would affect scenes when done well. Um, I've rewatched the series, both seasons, 3 times now. So I've watched like the initial watch and then so rewatched it twice. So I've seen it all together 3 times, and I find that like whenever you see the demons disappear into dust, it just makes me weirdly emotional, especially with Lee Scoresby's scene and with Hester. Um, Even though it's super sad when you read it, to actually visually see it on screen, I don't think and I was talking about how, your imagination kind of fills up the screen. I just didn't realize how much that would impact me emotionally watching it. And it could also be because I've never seen an adaptation of The Subtle Knife, so that's just amazing in itself to even get a live action adaptation of the second book. Because even when they announced the series, it actually took a couple years for it to kind of get off the ground. Because I think they announced it in 2015 or 2016, and then the first season didn't come out until 2019. So it was a little bit of waiting. So I wasn't sure if they would only do season 1 that's based on Northern Lights, or it's called the Golden Compass in North America. But to be able to see the Subtle Knife was very, very cool. And now that they for sure are doing, and they are currently filming, Amber Spyglass, I can't describe how excited I am for the Amber Spyglass, because there's so much stuff that happens in that book that I can't wait to see on screen. And honestly, like, I have an idea of what it looks like in my head, but I'm very excited for what they're going to do to build certain parts of the multiverse and like different worlds. And yeah, it's a pretty intense conclusion to a series, and I think that's what stood up for me so much reading it as a kid. I think it was the first book series where I realized that books didn't necessarily have to have a really happy ending to be a really good story. Because the Historic Material series, it's not that it's sad or upsetting per se, but it doesn't end in a way that's necessarily extremely happy. It ends in a way where what the characters do and all of their actions and their sacrifices, this is where it leads them. And when you're taking down authorities and you're taking down institutions, the sacrifices have to be great. And this series never shied away from that. So for anyone who is listening to this, and for anyone who is excited for season 3 or is going to be reading the books, just know that the Amber Spyglass is a lot of pain, is very sad. It's hopeful, but you have to get through a lot. And it makes me super excited that people are excited about this series. Just genuinely. Like, whether, I know it's not everyone is going to like it, and not everyone is a fan of reading either, but I'm just extremely happy that for those who are watching it and who are invested, that they really enjoy the world building and they really enjoy the characters. Because I think it's a testament to the original story and the original books, but also the successes of what these creators, whether it's the scriptwriters, producers, actors, everyone involved, what they've done to bring it to life and to have it on screen has made it so special. And I consider myself very lucky to have my favorite book series actually have a successful television series, and for it to be as good as it is. And I know that's not always the case. There's been adaptations in the past or even in the present that people are disappointed in, and you're always going to disappoint someone, I think, making an adaptation. But as someone who's such a huge fan of the books, I feel like they've done such an incredible job, and I know some people are wondering, oh, do I have to read the books first before I watch the series? And in all honesty, as someone who's a fan of both, I do actually think that they've done such a good job that you don't have to read the books necessarily to enjoy the TV series. Obviously, you'll have more information and you'll know what's coming up, but I think it's such a solid adaptation that you don't really have to worry about that. And I think that really, you know, speaks to the 3 points that I said, where does it capture the spirit of the original source material? Absolutely. Is it exactly what's on the page? No, of course not. Like, it understands the limitations of the television medium and how it has to adapt. And it understands that everyone has a different imagination and it fills up the empty spaces, but what they filled up on the screen is a lot. And I did mention earlier that in season 1 they didn't quite have the budget for the demons because there were so many people on screen, but with season 2 it's a lot more confined. That's not a great word to describe it, but it's a lot more focused, I guess, on singular characters or just like a few characters. That they really, really did well with the CGI with all of the demons, especially, I think, obviously with Pan, but Mrs. Coulter's golden monkey. I think there's so many comments online that are like, I can't believe they've made me feel bad for this like demon monkey. And it's true, because when you read about that demon in the book series, you never feel bad for it. You're just kind of like, oh, this demon's awful, Mrs. Coulter's awful. But they've really explored her character, which of course means exploring the demon and the relationship the two have, that you do feel sad and you feel, I guess, sympathetic for not only the demon, but, or actually that's like something that has happened, that people are like, I feel so bad for the demon, but you know, Mrs. Coulter's really awful. And I'm like, you literally can't just feel bad for one and not feel bad for the other to some extent, because they are one and the same. And I think that's something that they've portrayed pretty well on screen, that they are the same, that it is literally your soul. I think there are still some scenes that it kind of feels like a companion, like a separate entity, but I think overall, especially in season 2, like I said, it's a bit more character focused, that they were really able to get that right. I feel like it's such an interesting concept as a whole with demons that I don't think anyone could ever quite get it on screen, is how complicated and complex that actually is. And that's nothing to do with the creators. That's just how complicated that concept is. And yeah, like I said, I think that they've done a pretty good job with that. But yeah, like I think there's a lot of merit to give to the movie, in the sense that they were trying to do something with that, but I think they were just doing it too early, at a time where I feel like the studio just felt like, this is another fantasy series, and it is, like, there's fantastical things that happen in it, and there's creatures and things that don't exist in our world, but His Dark Materials is very much about people, and society, and there's a lot going on in that, as are most book series, as are most children's series. But I think they just were trying to do it a little too early, and the motivations were more to create more successful book series adaptations, because that was kind of like the new thing to do, like on the heels of, like, again with Harry Potter, or like, and then as you continue on, it was like Hunger Games and Twilight and everything like that. Everyone was just kind of like, let's keep trying different books and see like what sticks and what doesn't. Whereas like now in the 2020s, with the breathing room that a TV series gives the material, I think now was the right time to really create this again, or attempt to create it again, and they've done such an incredible job. I don't know how many times I can say that, but I really, it does make me excited that people get excited for it. And I think adaptations will always be difficult, and they're always going to be hit or miss, but when people really care about the source material and they want to make the best version of it that they possibly can, it shows. And what was really cool was with season one. So the entire first season was written by Jack Thorne. It was a passion project of his, and you can tell it's written by the same person. But in season two, he brought on 4 other writers. There's 4 women, and you can also tell that there's more writers working on it. And that to me is again a testament to how much they care about the material. If it's very obvious that you have different writers and you have different perspectives as episodes are being shown, that shows that there's growth, and that shows that, hey, I'm adapting something else, like the second book in the series. I'm going to need different perspectives and I'm going to need different writers to help make this successful. I feel like, especially if something is a passion project, there could be a lot of ego that goes into that and thinking I can create the best version of this. And for there to be a change in the writer's room, or like an addition to the writer's room, and for it to be so obvious that there were, I think that was great. And that's what made season 2 so good. I was actually kind of surprised at how much I love season 2. Not because I didn't like the book, even though The Subtle Knife is my least favorite of the trilogy, but the only reason it's the least favorite of the trilogy is that Philip Pullman really saw his Dark Materials as one whole story. So because it's that middle book, and this has now happened with the new series that he's writing within this world, it does feel like a middle book. Like, it kind of just starts and then it kind of ends, and it does sort of have a full story, but you can tell that it is a bridging book between Northern Lights and the Amber Spyglass. So that's why, for me, even though there were so many cool concepts introduced and so many cool characters, that that book was never my favorite in the series. And actually, speaking of characters being introduced, they did cut a little bit near the end of the book, which they're moving to the 3rd season, and I totally understand why, because when these characters are introduced in the book, you barely have any time with them. They're just kind of right at the end, and you're like, oh, I want to know more. But you also don't know how important they're going to be or who they even are. They're just kind of there. So I think the choice to move them to season 3 and to give them good, I keep saying breathing room, but yeah, breathing room to explain and introduce those characters properly, is going to be a great choice for the conclusion of the series. And how they've sort of ended season 2 was interesting, because there was also supposed to be another episode. So season 2 only ended up being 7 episodes, but there was supposed to actually be an 8th episode that they never got around to filming because of COVID. But cutting it was fine, because it was a whole episode that they added of material that wasn't actually in the original book. So unfortunately, the producers and the scriptwriters have said that they'll probably never get to film that episode. But because of that, they kind of had to do a workaround, and they changed the ending slightly. But it doesn't feel like that wasn't supposed to be the ending of the season. It does feel like a very natural ending to the season. And again, this is just the writers kind of flexing their skills, and then they had to film this ending completely like on green screen during COVID, and it was really cool. It adds a lot of anticipation to season 3, which again has such amazing things to look forward to. And I really hope that people who haven't read the books or who are reading it right now do really like the conclusion to his Dark Materials, because I feel, like I said, it was one of the most formative book series that I have ever read, and I will always go back to recommending them to people. And it's awesome now that there's a TV series that I can be like, or you can watch the TV series. If reading, isn't really your thing, and it's just great. We are in the correct timeline. I'm living in the right timeline where I'm able to enjoy this. So that to me is very, very exciting. And yeah, I guess like I said, this is just kind of like a introduction episode to his Dark Materials. I do want to go more into character analysis and plot analysis and everything like that. But this particular podcast episode was about, adaptations and just my general feelings on the series, whether it's the books or the movie or the television series as well. So I think the biggest takeaway from this episode is, first of all, I would like everyone to check out his Dark Materials if they haven't already. It's always very, very high on my suggestion list, whether it's books or TV shows. I think it's interesting to watch the movie, but I wouldn't consider watching the movie unless you've already seen the series or read Northern Lights / Golden Compass. Like, it's not one of the things where, like, oh, I'll watch the movie first and then continue stuff. Like, it'll put you, I don't think it'll put you away from wanting to read it or wanting to watch the series, but it doesn't do it justice in that way, even though I think there were a lot of amazing things that were done with it, and there were some really cool scenes, especially in 2008 with, the CGI and everything that they had for the time. But as a whole, I would, suggest either watching the TV series or reading the books, depending on what your interests are. And I just think that there's so much to explore when it comes to this series. And a lot of it is actually now being explored in the sequel series. It's weird. It's like the first book of the new trilogy is a prequel to his Dark Materials, and then the second and third books are going to be sequels. So the second one is out, and the third one is currently being written, and I'm waiting patiently for that. And it's really cool because it shows kind of the aftermath of what happens in his Dark Materials and who Lyra is as a character, but as an adult, a young adult. She's only 20 or 21, and just how much everything and all the events of the original trilogy affects her as an adult. And I think it's a very interesting perspective, and it's very much what I expected and who her character would be as kind of a 20-year-old. And I know it kind of has shocked people, the direction of where that series is going with that new trilogy, but I think for me it's kind of a weird misunderstanding of what was going on with his Dark Materials, because there's this part of me that I feel like there's a lot of nostalgia that comes with that series when you read it as a kid, and a lot of what you remember are like the demons and the polar bears. Like, the armored bears were super cool, and there's a lot of stuff that as a kid you kind of have a perspective of it just being like super cool and this like fantasy. But I do suggest, if anyone who has read the series before and is rereading it again as an adult, like, you kind of have to let go of a lot of that stuff and try to reread the series or even just watch the television series with a different lens, because I feel like parts of it will be hard to enjoy in the TV series because you're expecting certain things that you loved as a kid, and you as a person have changed now as an adult. So what I do like is that it just goes the full mile. It doesn't hold back on some of the darker parts of that series, and it's called his Dark Materials, but it is a dark series overall. And I don't think that, I guess, like, what I'm trying to say is that people shouldn't take that lightly, and it takes away from enjoying the series if you think you're kind of going to get a happy ending type thing, because it's weird to me that people have read the book series and felt like it was a happy ending. I mean, that's like, I don't know. I don't know either than how to describe that, but weird, because I just, even when I was a kid, I never felt like it was that happy of an ending, but I never thought that made it a bad series. So hopefully some people agree with me on that, but if you don't, that's okay. Everyone has their own opinions and how they experience stories, so there's not one right way to experience a story, but you do get different things out of them. And I feel like when I've discussed this series before, there's not a lot of people that have had the same experience with it that I have, so it's been kind of difficult to talk about it. So it's been nice to have this sort of outlet, and knowing that I'm going to be getting into it, into more detail in future episodes. But yeah, so I think that's really most of what I wanted to talk about. Again, this is more of an introduction to his dark material, so I didn't really get too into it. But hopefully you enjoyed what I said, and guaranteed there will be more episodes about his dark material. So definitely tune into those if you're already interested, or if you're watching the series, or if you've read the books. I will really dig into some deep dive analysis and discussion. And yeah, so that is the end of episode 2. Thank you again for tuning into the first episode, and thank you if you are tuning into the second one. And I hope that you will continue to listen to me talk about things that I love, apparently. And if you haven't already, you can follow the Twitter, which is ADOC, or sorry, at ADOC Podcast, and also you can subscribe to the channel. That would be awesome. And again, thank you for listening, and I will see you. I never know how to end this. I said this last time, but until next time.